So, welcome everyone. I'm very happy to be here today to be presenting David Chenery, and I am Eleni Michael. I have been selected to chair this discussion as I have background in operations, hospitality operations, from luxury hotels, catering companies, and Michelin-star restaurants, shifting my career into farm to table and zero waste restaurants, looking at circular systems where actually operations give more than they take. And this is exactly the talk of David today, who is the founder of Space Place in London and also member of Sustainable Restaurant Association for the past 5 years. Object Space Place is a sustainable design firm focusing on interior architecture, interior design, and branding for hospitality companies. Um, David has developed a restorative design framework, and he's also the co host of the podcast Hospitality in the Infinite Game, as well as a co host on the Clubhouse Room Sustainable Hospitality. So I will give the stage to David now, who will talk to us about how they design sustainable operations that give back more than they take.
Thank you, Eleni. That was perfect. I need to take you with me everywhere to introduce me, so I appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen so that there will be some pictures to look at alongside the words. So this should work fine. I'm going to go to full screen mode. Ellie, can you confirm you can see that okay? That
Yes.
first slide?
Okay.
Great. Okay, fantastic. If you've guys got any questions along the way, please feel free to add them into the chat. I think Eleni or Felicia will be looking at that. We may come to them at the end. We may come to them when they're relevant. There's no hugely formal structure here. We're just hoping to be as helpful as we can. So the point today is, the question is how circular interior design can create a restaurant that gives more than it takes. Probably worth just taking the slightest step back to give some origin for how we even came to be looking at this. And it really came from a first conversation I had with Andrew Stephen from the SRA a couple of years ago, whereby we were musing over the idea, or he was musing over the idea of what actually would a restorative restaurant look like? What would that be? How can you create one? And that question stuck with me as a designer, and we've been looking into sustainability for a few years. And it really, when I was thinking about it and trying to find a simple answer, it boiled down to me as one that could give more than it takes. If we want to restore something, we are giving more than we're taking. And how do we do that from a design perspective? Is that even possible? Is what we're doing at the moment enough? If we're looking at, hey, we're going to use a more recycled material, what does that mean? So that sort of set out our journey, or set out the path, I guess, for the journey for us to develop the restorative design framework, which I'll take you through a bit today. But I guess just backing up a little bit even from there, if we want to get restorative restaurants and we're looking at the design industry, what is the problem today? What is the even issue? Do we need to solve anything, or are we okay? So as soon as someone joins, that seems to affect the slides. Can you see my next slide? You can, okay. I was nervous about this. The problem is that in the UK, the construction industry broadly overall, that includes buildings rather than just fit out as well, is the largest consumer of natural resources at 400 million tons per year. The average lifespan of a restaurant is only 5 years before often they fail, sadly. And an interior space within a building will probably be fitted out 20 to 30 times in its lifetime. So there's a hugely cyclical nature to this, where we're taking stuff and then we're making something of it, and then it's sort of failing and ending, and we don't really know where it goes. And that's kind of the issue, is at the moment it's very fragmented. And what that means is people talk about this idea of a linear economy. And before we start talking about circular design, it's worth understanding what linear economy is. Now, many people here probably already know, so I will not go into too much detail here, but the principle is we take resources out of the ground, we turn them into something that we use, and then when we finish using it, it goes away to this special place, which might be recycled, it might be the landfill, we don't really know, we don't keep track of it. And that's the problem. you create a huge amount of waste as a result of that. The circular economy, in simple terms, takes that line and bends it around on itself. So it's trying to take out the idea of waste entirely from where we are. That's a nice, simple explanation of what we're trying to do. So what is the circular economy? If anyone wants to know more, I would definitely say the best place to go is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. That is the same Ellen MacArthur that sailed around the world, and now she's trying to save it. So it's really interesting, a lot of resources, podcasts, case studies, everything looking at circular economy. But there are 3 core principles that we look at. The first one is designing out waste and pollution. The second one is keeping products and materials in use at their highest level for as long as possible. And the third one is regenerating natural systems. So again, that's 3 principles, relatively simple to understand. We're okay, we know what we're doing with that. Applying them is a different issue, but we know that that's some relatively simple thinking. As a quick tangent, you might be asking the question, well, hang on a sec, how does circular economy relate to net zero? Because surely we're trying to cut carbon, greenhouse gas emissions. How do those 2 things go together? The answer, as I understand it, is that circular economy is part of the solution. I think in 2019, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation did a survey, and they were looking at, or did some research, not a survey. If we managed to apply the principles of a circular economy to the manufacture of cement, aluminium, steel, plastics, and food, then we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, carbon, by 50% by 2050. So the answer is a circular economy is part of that strategy. So again, okay, that sounds relatively simple. The challenge comes when you start to dig into circular economy. You get presented with a much more complex diagram than that one I showed you before. So I'll just give you a second to drink in the complexity of this diagram here. This is often referred to as the butterfly diagram. And immediately you might start to glaze over and think, wow, this is ridiculous. How am I going to do anything with this? In really simple terms, the left-hand side, you can think of, let's think of this in terms of biological elements, biodegradable food systems, that things get consumed and the waste from that can go through and become compost and feed back in to the beginning of the system. So this is the idea of a loop and a circular economy, and it's on this side. So this is about the regenerative side. The right-hand side is more to deal with the design that we're talking with. And you get different loops here of going back, of how we can reuse, recycle every all the components that we've taken out from the ground. So immediately you can start to see, wow, this gets a bit scary. We can take materials and we can recycle them back to the beginning of the process and then remanufacture them. We can look at the sharing economy. We can look at how we maintain and repair items we have to avoid them being recycled. The principle is that there are lots of different loops and ways of creating these circular loops to minimize waste. The point is all of these avoid this last arrow where we chuck it in the ground or we incinerate it. So that's the principle of what we're trying to do. But as I say, the challenge is that when you look at that, I personally found it very difficult to immediately think, how is this going to apply to design of a restaurant? What does that even mean? How are we going to look at that? And one of the ideas I think that comes immediately to mind to me from that is actually it's important to remember there is not one solution. There's not one way of doing this. And as an example, I'd point to the difference between the approach of, say, Douglas McMaster at Silo and Adam Handling with his group of restaurants. Now, Ellenie's going to give us a bit more detail here, but the point for me was Douglas McMaster and Silo works as an ecosystem within itself. It is trying to be one loop with zero waste. Adam Handling's approach across multiple restaurants is to create an ecosystem across them, whereby the resources and waste might be shared across different restaurants. Both of those approaches are valid and fine and work on the same principle, but it's an interesting example of those sorts of things. So Eleni, did you want to tell us a bit more, given you've got experience of both of those, about how they worked and how they responded to circular economy?
Yes, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I had the privilege to run the Zero Waste project of Adam Handling last year, Ugly Butterfly, on King's Road in Chelsea. And what we were aiming to do there is actually adapt to the demand of luxury market and actually educate people and make them curious and interested and naturalize this sustainable and conscious behavior towards food. So try and get London's richest neighborhood, which is Chelsea, to come and taste waste, but otherwise imagine and reframed and presented, which was actually beautiful dishes and scrumptious flavors coming from the other outlets of the group, being the hotel nearby, where we were cycling and bringing the byproducts and offcuts of pieces of meat, of vegetables that were not being used, as well as the fine dining restaurant in Covent Garden and the more no-frills restaurant in Shoreditch. So it was a circular system between 4 outlets where we were creating something beautiful out of the byproducts of the other restaurants that people were already used to Adam's cooking style, and they were very curious to come and taste what zero waste dining looks like, and they were very impressed. So in that way, we're naturally getting people to try something that they wouldn't otherwise try just by listening to the word waste. Douglas McMaster, on the other hand, I feel is the premium benchmark to where sustainable food and sourcing and cooking should be, but is creating a circular system of its own by looking at not only where the ingredients are coming from, shipping in chocolate, for example, on zero emissions ship, which is one of the very few exotic ingredients that he's sourcing, and also focusing very much on local produce, working with local farmers, and also designing furniture made of recyclable materials, which is also what we tried to do at Ugly Butterfly. We took furniture from landfill that were redesigned and repurposed, but just slightly on a more budgeted side for that particular outlet. So we have 2 systems, one creating a circular design in its own, and the other one between different outlets to actually set a benchmark maybe for other operators who also have their own groups or chains, larger chains of food outlets. Please let me know if you have any questions on that, and I'll let David continue.
No, thank you. That's really interesting to hear your insight from the inside of that. Yeah, that's good. I quite like these images as well, because it does look like they are both competing in who can have the most masculine apron competition, doesn't it? There's something about the way that aprons have developed in the last few years, but yeah, these look like next level aprons. So I think the food system, the thing about the systems there is really interesting, because you start realizing that to look at circular economy, you have to look at systems, and then it gets really complex and in some ways quite difficult. And that's part of the problem with circular economy, is that the systems aren't really in place to deliver this holistically overall. And what we're trying to do is innovate and point out where those currently can work and where they can't, and kind of develop partnerships with people who are doing interesting things. So we took all of those principles and we thought, okay, well, how can we apply this to the design process of a restaurant? So luckily we went back to a simple diagram. So we're okay again, we've moved away from the butterfly. So we look at 3 stages of the life cycle of a restaurant when you're looking at the design and fit out. Number 1, demolition and strip out. What are you doing before you even do anything? What is there? Number 2 is the core of low impact design. So that's the bit we would normally think about with the design and fit out of a restaurant. And then number 3 is the bit that, to be honest, even as a designer, I've never really thought about hugely enough, in years gone by. And that's end of life. What happens afterwards? What happens later on beyond the life of what we've designed something for? So demolition and strip out, the first phase, as I mentioned, is a case of looking at what you've got. What have you been gifted by the site? What can you work with that's already there? This is also a good place for sustainability and saving money to align, because you should be working with what you're given. So I've got a few slides to show that a bit more, but then whatever you don't keep, there then also needs to be a proactive strategy for dealing with the waste and the demolition that comes out of that. Again, I don't think the systems are there enough for people to deal with that. Often we just use a waste contractor who may recycle stuff, may not. It's a difficult problem we don't want to deal with often. So we're still trying to find the right network of partners. There's good people like Globe Chain. If you've got a larger hotel, you can go to someone like Clean Conscience who are getting involved in hotel strip outs and redistributing that stuff. You can talk to local charities and charity shops, but they can be quite difficult because they want, if you're giving them furniture, they want it to be proven to be fire rated, or they can only take 6 chairs and 2 tables and all this sort of stuff. So the systems aren't quite there yet, but we feel it's a duty, really, if we want to be sustainable, to understand where this stuff goes. So just as a couple of visual examples, I suppose, if we're going to go look at a site, we need to be thinking about, well, what are the qualities we've got to work with there? What is the natural light coming in there? We've got I actually think that this wall finish here, which hacked off over time, is quite beautiful. Can we just keep that and do something on top of that rather than add another finish, add more stuff? What is it that we can do? And this is where you need some flexibility and creativity in the design to respond to the site, which, to be honest, is what all good architecture and design should be doing anyway, to celebrate the space that you're in. In slightly more, sorry, things have gone a bit funny. In slightly more gritty commercial sites, you might do a more involved audit to think, well, what can we keep? Can we keep, for example, bits of a ceiling grid and spray this out a different color? But this is, again, where that creative thinking needs to come in. We need to understand how we can save as much as possible, even in the perhaps the most unpromising of spaces. Another example is actually if you've got multiple sites, that you might need to reuse stuff from those and bring those in. This is an example called Caraway Bakery. It's actually in Westfield Shopping Centre. And when we worked on that, we actually had to retain and use a number of elements from a previous fit out, and like a jigsaw puzzle, piece those together into a new site. So we brought the new elements and the old elements together as part of the creative brief there. So again, we're trying to reuse as much of the existing as we can. The ultimate aim, obviously, is to avoid anything just being chucked in a skip and hoping it gets recycled. Nobody is perfect. I'm not aware of a building site that can operate without a skip at the moment. I'm excited to be challenged by a project where we can avoid having any skips. But right now, I think that's the dream and the aim, right? The point is to be using everything. Economy is that we can waste it entirely in the end. It's a challenge if you're ripping out somebody else's fit out, which hasn't been designed for that. Then we move into the middle bit, the complex bit. There's an awful lot that we could talk about in here about how we create low impact design. I'm just going to try and touch on a number of them and try and keep it clear. Measuring where you assess this. What method are you going to use to keep score on and really hold yourself to account? And then once you look at that, we can also look at operational carbon, i.e. energy usage. What can you do to reduce your ongoing consumption of energy? Then we look at embodied carbon, i.e. the stuff that's coming in. Where is that coming from? What's involved in making it? And then there's also design principles in here. So flexibility is a really key one, actually. We need to design spaces to allow for future changes. I mean, if COVID's taught us anything, designing in perhaps are not actually going to be just for that. If you've got a space and you realize you want to become a hybrid co-working space in a year's time, and you've built in loads of fixed booth seating that can only seat 4 to 6 people, then you've designed out the flexibility of your ability to change. So that doesn't seem very smart. So how do we design things for maximum flexibility? Just on assessment methods really quick, the one that we go to and think has a lot of merit is the SCAR system. This is it is relatively particular to the UK, but it's a qualitative system where you go in and it's specifically geared towards the fit out of interior spaces. So you will 160, and you will go in and you will tailor the scope against what you are doing. So if you are, for example, using timber, there is a method in here, and you will put that down in the scope, and then say you've got 52 of those measures in scope. You can either get to bronze, silver, or gold, depending on how many of those you manage to hit. It can be to account and keeping score, and it's something that we're building into to all of our projects from now on. As an example, once you've got all of yours in scope, you will then have a sheet per good practice measure, and it will say, for example, great joinery, so your criteria is 100% of the timber must be either reclaimed or come from sources with a chain of custody certificate, so FSC or something similar, and you kind of pass or fail. So this is a way we're and that assessment system to give us a real, again, as I say, holding us to account really, and making sure we push for the best things. On operational carbon, it isn't something that's directly involved in what we do as the designers or architects of the space, but we're very aware that we can work with partners like Mesh Energy or people like this who can help design your MEP installations to ensure that they are as efficient as they can be and therefore reduce your energy costs. Anyone that saw me on the workshop yesterday will know I mentioned this Hammerson energy report. This is a page from that which looks at what you can do to design and adjust your internal fit out and your MEP specification to reduce your energy costs. So that is a key area of this reduction as well. We all know that generally in interior spaces and restaurants, gas is broadly something we need to get rid of wherever we can. There are instances, obviously, where cooking on gas just gives a very particular flavor. Less good environment than moving to electricity wherever we can. The electric, obviously on lighting, we need to use LED lights wherever we can. We need to minimize the use of electricity and use renewable electricity wherever we can. Similarly, there are methods in terms of water, which is not tied actually to operational carbon, but the water efficiency is something that we should be aware of when we're looking at the design of the site. So we're looking at low flow taps. We're looking at, can you use waterless urinals? What are you doing to minimize your water waste? Use on bigger sites, you may grey water system, or where you can reuse rainwater, etc., to minimize what you are taking, what resources you are taking from the world, so to kind of make your restaurant function. In terms of a few design principles, I think one generally is that if you look at sustainability, we do want to be reducing as much as we can. So minimizing the new elements that you put into a space is a really good way to make sure that we are not taking too much. In some ways, this can be quite tricky depending on the type of restaurant you have. Hospitality is one of generosity. We want to be giving more to our customers that come in. We want to give them more than they expect. And I think that's completely right. But I do think there's a case of us dialing back and understanding what is the minimum we can do to deliver that experience. For example, here in Smacka, this site had a lot of exposed concrete columns, and we opted to just use give an experience, but actually do the minimum, put the minimum amount of stuff into that space. So minimizing new elements is a key thing. Again, there's a nice cost advantage to doing that. We also want to create healthy spaces. If we want to be giving more than we take, then we need to be thinking a bit more holistically. There are principles such as biophilic design and things like that. But when we look at in there, we want to be maximizing natural daylight. There are some really interesting, more advanced ideas around if you can use green walls in restaurants to almost double as natural air conditioning systems. So there are some quite almost out there ideas which we're looking to bring into some restaurants in the future. But that's part of this idea giving more than you take. I know I'm skimming over quite a lot here, so if anyone has any more questions, I'm happy to dive into it. Sorry, I'm having problems with my internet here. Responsible sourcing, I think, is a massive part of this, where we of the impact we have. So possible if we are, like Eleni said, reusing previous furniture, even if that's keeping it and adjusting it, whether that's painting it in this case, or sourcing it from people who are doing good things. So, you know, there are social enterprises like the Raw Workshop or Goldfinger Factory, where they are creating joinery and furniture from reclaimed timber, and they're also a social enterprise. So Raw Workshop works with people who've perhaps come out of prison or have had various issues. Goldfinger are a social cafe, social enterprise cafe adjacent to where they are in London. So if we can work with people who are doing good, then that to me is another way we can look at creating restaurants that give more than they take. There is this social side beyond just the stuff. And that's where it starts to get quite interesting, I think. If you want to look at responsible sourcing, how do we quantify that? You can look at various places, like there's a cradle to cradle certification, which is really interesting. They look at, again, grading different materials by how they deal with even, you know, the water and the renewable energies in the production, whether they have take back schemes, etc. So cradle to cradle is quite good to look at. If you're trying to find reclaimed materials and resources, there's a really good website called opalis.co.uk, which is OPALIS. You can look by kind of geographic location. It will show you different reclamation yards, show you whether they're selling timber, tiles, etc. That can be quite a good place to go to as well. In terms of real specifics on materials, you know, we can look at using marmoleum, which is a kind of more natural material than vinyl for flooring in the back of house. Paints, we can look at more eco paints. So there's things like graphene stone, which is, again, that's got a cradle to cradle certification, very, very low kind of carbon footprint, and, you know, much better in terms of off gassing than things like Dulux and Farrow and Ball and those kind of ones. Try and avoid white rock, and it's the cheaper version in the kitchens for the walls, but if you can use, you know, stainless steel, which is from highly recycled content and also highly recyclable, or tile finishes, then you're going to have a better impact than you had before with the PVC. If you're using any timber, you also want to be going for FSC rather than non-FSC. I guess it's the difference between getting organic eggs or non-organic. There's just more control about what's involved in creating it. So after you've looked at that, then the question from a design perspective for us is, how do we design for end of life? And this is a bit of a tricky one in many ways, because again, the question comes back to, are the systems already here to allow this to work? But as a designer, we're taking on the duty that we need to design things to minimize their impact. Therefore, we have to look for them. And there are 4 ways really at the moment we can do that. One is one we're in control of, which is design for disassembly. So we need to design things in a way that they can come apart. There's no good specifying a countertop material that's made from 80% recycled content or recycled yogurt pots, and then gluing it down to a sheet of plywood in such a way that at the end of that use of that counter, you just have to throw it in the skip, or it's contaminated and can't be recycled. That needs to be detailed in a way that it can come apart, and the timber go to a place to be used another way, and the plastic go to a place to be used another way. So that's quite a challenge. And it throws up some issues around how you detail things, what materials you can use and can't use. Then there are other things we can look at. So we're trying to build relationships with suppliers and manufacturers who will have a specific take back scheme. So at the end of life, they will come and get the flooring, for example, when you've finished with it, rather than you having to dispose of it. Or looking at people where there are more models now increasingly where you can get a lease hire arrangement. So there's interesting ideas around the subscription economy. Can we get furniture manufacturers where you can rent the furniture rather than own it? I think that's really interesting. Philips Lighting have also started looking at the idea of if they can basically sell you a light level and then they will deal with all the stuff around the time. You're buying the light level and they will deal with the kind of logistics of keeping that there, which is kind of interesting. Or even on a simple level, having an identified route for reuse or resale at the end. So if you have a chair, you know you should be able to get rid of that at the end. But if we're going to design something and bring it into the space, we need to understand where is that going to go at the end. Design for disassembly, just as an example, this was a ceiling raft we designed for a restaurant in Mayfair called Taka. So the principle is we're designing this so that it can be removed. It also helps, to be honest, in the construction of it. So some of this stuff doesn't have to be rocket science, nor does it have to look sustainable or eco. It's just about applying some different principles. So I guess if you want to think with a circular mindset, there are just a couple of questions that you can keep in your armory when you're looking at anything. And I think one is, where has it come from and what was involved in making it? And two, where will it end up and who will be responsible for that? And those two questions can be quite hard to answer. And I certainly wouldn't suggest that we know all the answers to those. But those are the irritating questions we keep asking now as we're looking to design more and more spaces that push on with this agenda. There's also a question, I think I touched on it already, circular economy is hard. It involves systemic change, and those systems aren't necessarily all there at the moment, nor in the scope of these kind of building approaches have they been tested enough, because we haven't done enough cycles. We haven't designed a space that has been disassembled yet. So there is a lot of this is theory. There are also challenges in how we look at the reality and the pragmatic reality of this. So for example, if you want to bring in timber and line the walls with timber, because perhaps you want to avoid plasterboard, because plasterboard is almost impossible to recycle. So let's line our walls with FSC plywood, and that'll be a really nice finish. Great. To comply with building regulations, that wall finish will need to meet class 1 for surface spread of flame. So you need to then put a chemical treatment onto that timber, which is then going to be there and off gas and is not good for future recyclability. But you're still doing better than if you put plasterboard on in the first place. So when we talk about this idea of circular-ish, it is imperfect at the moment, but I think we just need to look at doing as best we can to push towards this future and then look at changing the systems as we can along the way. So I guess the message is there, don't let perfect get in the way of good right now, because perfect doesn't exist. Coming back to the original title, can we ever give more than we take? I'm sure the first law of thermodynamics is that energy can't be created, it can only be changed. So maybe there is something that we can't ever actually give more than we take. But I think it's certainly an ambition and a philosophy for us to get there. This idea, if we move from linear to circular, we'll certainly be doing an awful lot more of giving than taking, because we'll just be more aware of what we're doing. It's something we're pushing towards, but there are also examples where you can get there. For example, if anyone's come across a company called grown.bio, they have these pendant lights that are grown from mycelium, so the root structure of mushrooms. And I haven't looked into the claims in detail, but they say that all of these products have a negative carbon footprint. So that's really interesting, because then obviously now you're doing something positive beyond what you're actually putting into the space in the first place. So there are these tantalizing glimpses of how we can do this. Another question you might be thinking, is it more expensive to do this? And again, if anyone saw the session yesterday, you'll have saw me say that there isn't really any data that I can find that says whether, for example, scar is more expensive. There have been some studies done that have looked at the overall built environment, and that building in a more sustainable way can add between 2 and 12% to the build cost. But there are almost too many variables to be able to give a proper figure. It's something we want to study in the next year or two on live projects. But there are examples for the restorative design framework where if you're retaining a lot of previous infrastructure and stuff, you can save a lot of money. We did a coffee shop on King's Road for the Real Eating Company in October last year, where because they took over an Eat location and operationally they were very closely aligned, we were able to retain about 80-90% of the previous fit out. And she probably only spent 20% of what you would have spent to fully fit out that space if you'd started from scratch. So in that instance, applying the framework kind of nicely ties in with a Scrooge-like approach to spending money. So there can be some good alignments, but in other ways, being more sustainable will cost more. FSC plywood coming from managed forests will cost more than a plywood that you just don't ask any questions about. That's just the truth. So the answer is it's complex, but I do firmly believe you can design more sustainable circular restaurants that are not more expensive if you make the right decisions and you're willing to have that as your kind of guiding North Star in your decision making, and you know from the start. I really do believe that, and I think we're looking to prove that on a few sites in the coming years. If anyone didn't see the SRA talk yesterday and you're curious about circular economy and that whole idea of how you can create circular restaurants, Advanced London, which is now Re-London, part of the London Waste and Recycling Board, did a really good guide, good PDF in conjunction with the SRA, looking at all aspects of a restaurant, so the food and drink, the energy, the water, way beyond what I'm covering here. If you want to look at that, it's free on the internet. Just Google food that doesn't cost the earth, Advanced London, and you'll find the PDF and you can just download it. But I'd really recommend that. That's a good guide. And if you're keen to know more and kind of follow what we're doing in progress, we are filming a couple of projects at the moment. This one in particular, got a quick little video.
Arguably the country hasn't seen a restaurant like this for years. COVID floored us in multiple ways in terms of slowing down this build, but we also lost all our finance.
If you're going to innovate and change something, you have to accept that that is going to be hard.
We've got uniqueness in this building. There is uniqueness in the business model. There is uniqueness in cooking over fire and the flavours that that provides. It's just fucking great.
That is a project that we are currently working on called Kindle in Cardiff, and we've filmed the first episode just documenting the journey. We'll be filming 2 more. We'll be releasing those over the next couple of weeks, and don't worry, we won't let you miss them because we spent too much money on the videos to let anyone escape watching all the stuff. But we're on a journey ourselves, and we're looking forward to sharing with you guys what we're doing and learning. There's a little info at the end here. I hope that was helpful. If you want to know some more, the blog on our website is very active. I'm writing quite a lot and sharing a lot, so objectspaceplace.com is a good place to go. Instagram at objectspaceplace, if you like some pretty pictures, always good. If you've been bitten by the Clubhouse bug, then at David Chenery, or as Eleni mentioned, Sustainable Hospitality Club or the Infinite Hospitality Club, for some conversations and interesting chat with people around the world. And I can also be found roaming free on LinkedIn. So yeah, that's that really. Eleni, did you have any thoughts, questions, reflections, anything you want to bring in at this stage?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, very impressive everything you have discussed, of course. Looking at from the inside of the restaurant again, thinking of what we implemented at Ugly Butterfly and what can be adopted by other restaurants as well, is also thinking about restorative objects that you put in your space that will be regenerative in themselves throughout your operation in the long term. So for example, looking at recycling your candles, or what I did, I replaced fresh flowers with handmade paper flowers, and looking at the long term, we're saving over 1,000 to 2,000 flowers a year just from that detail. And then I won't go into detail about food, but there's so many processes that can be applied that I can answer any questions if people have here. But I think those are my thoughts so far. And in terms of the costs, as you said, it really depends on the luxury you want to portray, perhaps. But there's so many ways to look for other resources, like what we did. We we worked with entrepreneurs and people, like you said, supporting your community, supporting people who are doing something sustainable themselves. We sourced their upcycled bottles that they were turning into lamps, and they were custom made for us. So you can still create these bespoke design for your space while also helping other people who are trying to do something good for the environment. That's it from me. Thank you.
No, it all sounds great.
I would have a question. So I've been to your restaurant, Lenny. So I've had the experience of this amazing network with the hotels, and then that what is left over then was made into fantastic food. That would be very locally, I guess. But how is that with the interior design? You do need a network in the UK needs to build up so that you can get all of the material and things you need from the UK. I imagine you don't want to import that much. I would think. How is that going? Is that very difficult at the moment, or is that just in process that this is building?
Talking from my experience, I'm sure that David will know more about sourcing. I think what we did there, we worked individually with different companies that were specializing in their domain. Like, there was no platform that we went to look for these solutions. It was more of an organic growth and sourcing. But David perhaps might have an idea if there's a platform where you can direct people to.
No, not so much, and I think that's why that's why it's harder in some ways. Naturally, as designers, you build up contacts over time, which is just sort of you'll kind of organically do, or often you'll design a space and then you'll tender it with a main contractor, and then they will take control of the sub packages of subcontractors. They have their joinery people and their metalwork people. So in some ways, what we need to do is make designers more closely embedded with the people who are making each individual item, and that is just not something that really does exist. There's something called the House of Upcyclers, if you want to look at that.
Yeah, interesting.
They've got some interesting contacts there. But yeah, no, I don't have the answer other than building our own database of people that we know we can work with. So Moser tiles have got a lot of cradle to cradle certification. Great, we know we can use those and be happy that that's going to do it. We know a few people who can supply timber from sustainable sources. Okay, great. So there isn't really this one place that you can go that I'm aware of. It'd be great if there was, because our job would be easier to do this. And also there's so many variables. As you say, you might be doing a kind of low-key coffee shop in Brighton, or a 5-star super special experience in Mayfair. They've got different needs, and therefore you need different materials, and there's so many variables. Everything is so bespoke that it just takes more time, and that's what we're certainly finding is speed is kind of the enemy to innovating sustainably, and unfortunately, obviously most people want things done very fast, so that does prove to be a bit of a challenge.
David, Matthew just entered a comment in the chat saying that convincing teams not to overspend on fit outs and rather wisely invest in materials in the first place should be what we're doing. I think this is what Matthew is saying, right? Any of you in the audience who wants to unmute themselves, feel free, or post more questions in the chat.
Yeah, I think that question around how much you spend is a tricky one. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, as I think I've said before as well, I don't think it all comes down to customer experience. You want to create an environment that people want to come back to, and they crave what you do in any form. For some concepts, the quality of the environment and the surroundings are really important to doing that. So in getting 5-star hotel lobby, classical luxury, that customer experience, you need to invest more in every part of it, because you have to elevate the whole thing. If you're a restaurant like Padella, for example, you go there because of the location, because of the food, and because of it's trendy and cool and social media, and there's always a queue outside. Arguably in that instance, you only invest in materials in the place where it's really important. So it's about understanding the customer experience and what is most valuable for that particular space, and then doing those things as sustainably as possible. So I hope that makes sense. Good. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions or thoughts on that, or anything that wasn't clear? I see Helen's just given a nice note. Thank you, Helen, and thanks for joining. Yeah. Anyone have anything else they want to add?
If nobody does, I just wanted to know that I was impressed by the restaurant, the Japanese restaurant you designed in Mayfair, and because automatically thinking of sustainability, we're like, oh, but maybe one look as luxury if it's all upcycled things or easy to refit and remove, as you said, but it's actually very aesthetically attractive and very beautiful. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the, not the cost as a number, but how that can.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, that actual restaurant was designed as we were still developing our approach to sustainability. So that client and that restaurant was not all about sustainability in the same way that, say, Kindle is, or any other projects we're looking at now. So I think it would be disingenuous of me to say that that is a sustainable design, because there are things in there that I would not specify now. So the bar in the basement is clad in, I think I don't remember if it was Corian or Creon, but it's a solid surface, an acrylic solid surface, to get it as seamless finish. Now we use the one that is most recyclable, has the best credentials, but still I probably would try and not specify that now. But all the timber was FSC, but it does go to show that I think there's no one approach to sustainability, and we need to adjust that depending on what is right. So yeah, the visible look and feel of upcycling is only right in certain spaces. In others, it can be about elevating that kind of use of waste material into a craft, or designing things to come apart. So, I mean, Goldfinger Factory is actually a really good example of that as well. If anyone knows the furniture they make, they've got these beautiful coffee tables, herringbone timber on the top, and the herringbone timber is reclaimed floor from the Science Museum, and the frame is from old fixtures from John Lewis. But you wouldn't know any of that. It's just a beautiful table made of timber. But because they've taken those pieces and they've just designed something lovely and crafted it because that's right for that environment. But then that costs X £100, as opposed to going and getting a load of chairs secondhand from a church when you can do your whole restaurant chairs for 70 quid in total. There are just different approaches, and I think it comes back to that point for me, that you need to adjust it depending on what you do, because ultimately one way of looking at whether a restaurant is sustainable enough is whether it's still in business, right? There's no point, you could make the most sustainable eco cafe in the world, open it in Mayfair, and then 6 months later no one's come and you've had to close it down. All of the energy and materials and effort of making that happen are now going to get stripped out and thrown away, and someone else is going to come in. So you need to create the most sustainable version of your restaurant concept, really, and adapt to suit that, I think.
That's a great point there. Yes. I think, Alicia, did you have something to?
Yeah, I was just thinking while we were talking, how important is the aspect of, well, because I was remembering the lamp you showed, the ceiling lamp. Is that a good product in a sense? Is it durable? I mean, if there's water coming onto it, I mean, if you have to buy it again and again and again, it doesn't really.
Yeah, I've not seen any problems with durability with that particular lamp fitting, but that's where I think that whole idea of circular-ish comes in. Yeah. There is no, as much as we would like to be able to just put all of this into, onto a spreadsheet and say, right, this is good, this is bad, it just doesn't work. There's, life, everything is too messy and complex, and you've just got to try and find the best ways to be moving this stuff forward. So yeah, I think there is complexity in there. I mean, we were looking, the project I've mentioned there, Kindle in Cardiff, it's a freestanding old domestic bungalow which we're converting into a restaurant. So we're trying to do as little as possible in that space to change it, and we'd love to celebrate the old brickwork that's there, but that won't meet building regulations. So we need to put insulation on the walls and line out the walls. That's not something we really want to do, but we kind of have to do that to meet the thermal performance. Otherwise, you're going to be pumping in loads of heat into the space, which is going to leach out through the walls. But also, because the space is really small, we can't justify using natural, like sheep's wool insulation, because it's twice as thick. So you look at a plastic-based insulation, which is still, it's not horrific stuff, but it's stuff you'd want to avoid if you could, because if we made it thicker, we'd lose too much floor space for that restaurant to be able to function properly. So all of this is the complexity of the decisions we need to look at in trying to come up with a design. And there is never going to be one solution. It's just what's the best we can do. We're trying to push and set as many benchmarks as we can and explore that stuff. But I'd always say there is no one answer, and we certainly do not have all the answers, but we'll be sharing all the ones we do find along the way. Maybe it'll be like, an episode of QI where in 5 years' time we'll be saying, yeah, all that stuff we told you, yeah, that was kind of half right, but actually we know more now. I don't know, but we'll share and see what that says. I see Richard's got a question.
Yeah, another question.
Yeah, hi. It was just a question about the fit outs and some of that quite scary information about how often places will either go under or turn over, and just what happens to that kit. And that picture of a skip in a London street. And what is there any route to try and get into that sort of market? Because there'll be lots of organisations that can't afford to fit out to the level that some others can, but they're very much interested in what is happening.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It seems like a huge business opportunity to me, right? I mean, I think it feels like, from what we've seen, it's relatively ad hoc. People will try and sell stuff through Gumtree, or they'll sell it through eBay, or there'll be some local auction sites, or the landlord will hold on to that fit out and then try and sell parts of it to the incoming tenant. Or you can get waste companies whereby they will come in and take it and then segregate it and sell parts of it themselves. But I think it's still quite kind of fragmented. Such, there's Globe Chain, which is really good if you want to look at Globe Chain. As Gavin's just mentioned there's a company called Loop Cycle that's developing an app. I've seen it particularly working around catering equipment and the kitchen side of things. So trying to create a marketplace where people can come to get all of that kitchen equipment at a lower rate, and actually have that certified. So that they look quite interesting as well. But I don't think there is one, there is no one perfect solution for that exists at the moment. I mean, again, our client Kindle, they went to an auction locally because they knew that a few restaurants had closed down, and they were auctioning this kit off, all of their kitchen equipment, and they managed to get about 40 grand's worth of kitchen kit for about £14,000 second hand.
That's a good result.
There are issues because it needs to be cleaned. There's no warranty because it's second hand. Is it going to break down? There are risks there. But yeah, so in answer, no, not that I'm aware of. If anyone does, please let me know.
No, it's useful for those couple of recommendations. Thank you.
No problem. Okay.
Hello everyone, it's Gabriela. Hi David, and it's a thank you very much for a very interesting and impressive presentation, and thanks for a little intro mentioning our business and part of Loop Cycle. I think just one thought I wanted to share with everyone. I think one challenge that we found out is also the requirement of intensive collaboration in circular economy and aligning all the actors in the value chain. I just wanted to know your thoughts on this, how to overcome this challenge.
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that. I think you're right. I mean, circular economy, when you look into it, you realize it can only be built on collaboration. And then you've got to get involved with other people's businesses and other humans, and all of their idiosyncratic. How we get there. I think it's fascinating and really difficult. It feels like it's trying to solve all of the world's problems in trying to make circular economy work, which is why at the moment we're trying to reduce it down to something that we think we can look at and control and try. And that's why I say about trying to set up our own loops and little cycles and ecosystems and see what we can do to piece. It's almost, we need to prove it by doing it and seeing what we can learn and then sharing that with other people and then allow the traction of that to build. But yeah, I do not know. I'm sure there are some people smarter than me or more politically aware or better anthropologists that can help motivate humanity. But yeah.
Thanks, David.
No problem. Well, we're at 11 o'clock, and I guess we don't want to be one of those naughty people that go over our time. So is that worth wrapping up now, Eleni, Felicia?
I think so, yes. It's been a great session, and we had some very interesting input from the audience as well.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, hopefully that was helpful. I think I've got another session at 4 o'clock this afternoon with Andre talking about designing spaces for multiple revenue streams, which will be an interesting discussion with him. So yeah, maybe join you guys for that. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.